to be doing today is just picking up where we left off yesterday. So yesterday we had started going through chapter 1 in the server training. So we're just getting an introduction to what Fme Server is all about and kind of an overview of the web interface for Fme Server. And we got a look at the basics of how to create and publish a workspace up to Fme Server itself. So what we'll be doing for the last part of this chapter is looking at different ways of sharing your workspaces. So we're thinking from the perspective of we've created a workspace that we've published up to Fme Server, and now we'd like to give other users access to be able to either make changes to the workspace themselves or to be able to just run the workspace in Fme Server themselves. So we'll look at two different options for making that possible. So for anyone who's following along, we can send out the link to our current page in the training manual. You got that, Holly?
Yep.
Thanks. So Holly's here again. She's doing Q&A for now, and she'll be taking over.
Good morning.
She'll be taking over presenting for chapter 2. So definitely ask any questions you've got as we go, and let's get going, and we'll get going with the rest of chapter 1 here. So we're looking at sharing repositories. So we covered this a little bit at the end of the day yesterday, so we'll just do a quick recap. So security in Fme Server is basically based on whether you own a component or you've been given access to it. When you create something like a repository, when you're publishing your workspace, you will have full permission for that component. You're the owner, so you have full control over exactly who else would have access and over everything that's inside that component itself. So even if you don't have permission to manage security on Fme Server, you do have the ability to share things that you own with other users. So you can see here there's the share button beside most of the components in Fme Server. So we're looking at it inside repositories in this case. You can click on that and share your component with anyone else in Fme Server. When you click on that, you'll get a pop-up dialog that looks something like this. You can select the user or the role, which is a group in Fme Server, who would have access to the item. And then you can choose what kind of permissions they would have when they access it. So in this case, if we're looking at a repository, we can give people access to simply run workspaces and not do anything else with them. We can give them access to download the workspace itself, so they could make modifications if you wanted. And you could give them full access, so they could read and write, so they can make adjustments and edit the workspaces inside there. So let's get started straight into an exercise here. So we're going to look at exercise 1.5, and we'll look at sharing a repository with another user. So in this case, we're thinking that we've created this workspace that we've published to our training repository, but now we'd like to give other authors within Fme Server the ability to make edits to the repository. So if you happen to be on vacation one day and somebody needs to make a change in the workspace or fix something that's wrong, you're giving other people access to be able to do that as well. So let's give access to other authors, let's give other server authors access to that repository so they can run and modify the workspace as they need it. So for the first step, we can connect to our Fme Server. So if you're still logged in from yesterday, you should see a page like this. There we go. I'll go straight to my home page to begin. If you need to log into your server, so you can log in from localhost. If you just go to localhost in your web browser, you'll see that. So the first thing we want to do actually is log in as a different account. So at this point, we just want to see what it looks like if you log in as just another author within Fme Server. So we'll just see what they have access to. So if you're logged in as your admin right now, you can log out. If not, you can just wait at the login page. There we go. So if you need to log out, you can click on your user settings icon in the top right-hand corner. And we'll just select log out. I'll give you all a second to do that. When you're ready, we're going to log in as a generic author. So the username for this is author, and the password is the same, it's author. So for logging in as author, author. So the first thing to notice when you log in like this is that these author accounts don't have administrative privileges on your Fme server. So you'll see the admin section in the navigation is completely gone. That's because you don't have access to it when you're logged in with this account. Let's go to Run Workspace and see what we have access to next. So you can click on the Run Workspace button at the top. And under Repositories, we can look to see what we have access to. So you'll notice we have access to only 3 of the repositories. So you don't see that training repository listed here at all. And the reason for that is because we created that repository as an administrator, so using a different user account, so this author account won't have access to it by default. So if we wanted other authors to be able to access this repository, we'd need to make sure that that we share the repository with them so they can see it when they log into the Fme Server interface. So let's go back and share that repository with our author account. So let's log out of the author. So we'll go to User Settings and log out. And we'll log back in as the administrator. So admin as the user and admin as the password. And we'll see we've got the full set of menu options back again. So because we have access to security, we could actually just go in here and give the author account permission to see our repository. But because we wouldn't necessarily have security permission, let's do this from the perspective of owning the repository. So we're going to go into Repositories in Fme Server. So you can click on that. You can locate the training repository. So you can see we're listed as the owner for that. And let's click on the Share button on the right-hand side. So for this, we want to give other authors full access to this repository so they could come in and make edits if they needed to. So let's click on the drop-down for who to share with. So we could share this with just the author, so that's a single author account. The other option is to share with the Fme author role. So in the future, if we have other people who come in as server authors, they would automatically have permission to this repository. So let's do that. So we're going to share with the role so that anyone who has this author permission would be able to access our repository. So select Fme author as the role here. And for permission, we're going to give the authors full access. So we want them to be able to edit and manage the repository itself. So you can see now this Fme author is listed with full access permission for our repository. So before we click OK, we'd also like to share this repository with the Fme user account as well, just so that any users could come in and run this workspace if needed. So we're going to need this in a future exercise, so let's make sure to do that now and make sure we're set up. So again, we can click on the drop down and share this with another user. And we'll click the Fme user role for that. For them, they don't need full access. We don't need the users to be able to edit the workspace. We just want them to be able to run it. So under permissions, we can just give them can run permission. So your sharing options dialog should look like this now. We've got 2 roles that we're shared with their own sets of permissions. When you're ready, you can click OK, and that will completely share the the repository. So let's try this out now. So let's log out of our admin account and we'll log back in as the author account just to see what's changed now that we've shared the repository. So I'm going to click on user settings and log out. And we'll log back in as author and password author. And now let's go to Run Workspace and see what options we have there. We should see now we've got a training repository listed there. So as the author, we now have access to this. And we can see our exercise 1 workspace with the published parameters on it. You can see here as well, we also have the ability to download the workspace, and we could then make edits and republish that back to the training repository. So we can run this job just to test it, just to make sure we really do have permissions. You can see here, job ID approximately 13 with 14 features written. Can then go to the jobs page and take a look at what we can see. Just going to the completed page there. What's interesting here is you notice that we have run 13 other workspaces on the server, but since we're logged in as author now, we can only see the ones that we ran ourselves, so the ones that our username is associated with. So that's a difference in the permission levels for the administrator versus the author. So as an author, you don't have full access to everyone else's jobs. You can only see your own jobs that you've run on the server. So what we could do now is if we logged out, so if you want to log out one more time, we can log back in as the administrator. And now if we take a look at that same jobs completed page, you'll see we have a different view of that. So because we're administrators, we can see everyone's job. So I can see that an author ran job number 13, but we ran as admin for the other jobs. So you have a very different perspective as an administrator on the server. If I look at my filters as well, you can see I can filter by specific users. So I can see what everybody on my server has been doing. If I was to log in and look at the filters as an author, I wouldn't have the ability to filter by users. I would only be able to see my own jobs. So that brings us to the end of exercise 1.5 here. Let's just do a quick show of hands. Is everyone able to successfully complete that and see the sharing options? All right, looks good. Great. So I think we can move on to the next section then. So what we did here is that we shared a repository with other users who have access to Fme Server. So in order to be able to run this job or see it or interact with it, that user has to log into Fme Server first with their own account before they can do anything. What we're going to look at next is how to share a workspace with users so that they don't actually even have to log into Fme Server in order to run a workspace. So this is useful if you want to share a workspace with a broader set of people who may not actually have an account on Fme Server or may not have a good understanding of how Fme Server works. So you want to make it as simple as possible for them to be able to run workspaces and get access to the output. So this is using a brand new option for Fme Server 2019. So in the past, it was a little tricky to be able to share workspaces with people who didn't have an Fme Server account. So this new option is found under the Advanced section when you go to Run a Workspace. You'll see a section called Workspace Sharing. And it'll basically take you through a few steps in order to configure that. So it'll help you create a URL that you could then share with other users to let them run workspaces without logging into server. So when you click on the Share button, you'll be presented with a dialog that looks a bit like this one. And it'll basically be asking you to create an API token. And the token is the piece that lets this user authenticate without having to add credentials themselves. So the token would end up as part of the URL. By default, the token will have very limited permissions. The token will only allow for someone to run that workspace in that repository. You can also choose how long the token should last. So you could share a workspace temporarily. So if you wanted to share it for a couple of days with someone so they could run the job a few times and that's it, you can set up the token to expire. When the token expires, the user will no longer have access to that shared workspace through that URL. Once the token's been set up, you'll end up with a page that looks like this. You'll have your server app URL, which will look something like this. That'll point to the workspace in the repository with a particular service that you registered the workspace with. So you can copy that link and you could then send that to anyone and they could then open that link and see the Run Workspace page to run the job themselves. The other URL you will get is this web service URL, which can be used as a webhook. So if you have other systems that you'd like to be able to integrate with Fme, what you could do is put in this web service URL so that that system, when it is triggered for whatever reason, it could hit that URL or send data, or yeah, it could hit that URL, run the workspace, and get access to the output right away. So there's a few different scenarios where that comes in handy as well. So we'll look at how to set that up in the next exercise. So in exercise 1.6 here, we're going to be sharing the workspace that we created in exercise 1 so that anyone can run that whenever they need to. So let's go into Fme Server first. Let's go back to the home page. So in order to access Workspace Sharing, we can click on the Run Workspace page. So we can locate the training repository, so make sure that's selected, and select the Exercise 1 workspace. You can choose the service you want to run it with. Since we were only using Job Submitter so far, that's the one we'll use. And then down at the bottom, we've got this advanced panel. So you can click the arrow on the right-hand side. And we can see Workspace Sharing from here. So just click on Share this workspace. And it'll present you with some options for this. So we can leave the expiration date at default. So by default, it'll last for a year. You can choose to make that shorter or longer depending on what you need. You can give the token a name. So you can name this something to make it easier to remember what you were doing and why you shared this. So I can say sharing or shared exercise 1.6. And you can add a description as well. Then you can configure permissions. If you want your users to be able to upload their own data sets for sending into this workspace, you can leave this button checked. You can uncheck that if you'd prefer that they didn't change the input datas or data set. Down below here, you also have some additional permissions. So depending on what the workspace needs access to, you'll see these listed. So if you wanted to let your users have access to resources so they could browse for a data set, you could give them access to that. For this, we won't give them access to resources. We'll just say they can upload their own data sets for processing if they wanted to. When you're ready, you can click OK. And that'll present us with the dialog with the two links that we can use. So the one we'll look at here is the Fme Server App. So this will let any users run the workspace from their browser without having to log in, and it'll give them the option to configure any published parameters within the workspace. If you notice in the web service URL, it's a little bit different. So instead of popping up a page where they can configure the parameters, This one actually configures the parameter values directly in the URL. So you can see in here we've got source dataset underscore GML equals, and it has the path to the GML. So you'll be able to set each of those parameter values directly in the URL when you send the request in. So this is useful as a webhook. So if you're trying to call Fme Server programmatically, you can set up your application to set that URL to the values that you want, and then that application can send the request directly to Fme Server and set the parameters through the URL like this. So it'll just run the workspace directly with the values set inside here. So this one is a lot more interactive. So this is more useful if you want to share this with other people who would come in and make choices about the parameter values. So let's take a look at the first link. So you can click on the little copy icon at the end. And then we'll want to open up a new browser window that isn't logged into Server, just to prove that we don't have to log in. So I'm just going to right click on the Chrome icon in the bottom of my Windows menu bar here. And I'm going to open an incognito window. So this will just open a window where I'm not logged into Server. So I can go to localhost to confirm. And I can see I'm not logged in right now. Then I can open up a new tab and paste that URL we just copied. And this is what this looks like. So you basically end up with a very trimmed down version of the Run Workspace page. All you have is the name of the workspace and any published parameters that you can set, and you can click on the Run button. So that's all you can do. You can't interact with anything else in Server. You can simply run the workspace or set parameters and run the workspace. So I can click on Run here to get that going. It'll submit the job, and it'll give us some information about whether it completed successfully or not. So I can see my job ID as well as the number of features that were written. So if you wanted to see the difference with the other URL, you could copy that one as well. So I'm just going to copy that web service URL. I'll paste that into the incognito window. And the difference here is that instead of presenting with parameters, it actually submits the job as soon as I hit enter, and then I get a result back saying whether or not the job completed successfully. So it's a lot less interactive, but it is quicker, so I don't actually have to manually set any parameter values in there. It all comes from the URL itself. Okay, so that brings us to the end of this exercise. Can I get a quick show of hands on this? Is everyone able to run the workspace that way and see the two URLs? Okay, that's pretty good. I'll do one more show of hands. Does anyone need a little bit more time on that? Okay, good. No hands there, so that's good. Yeah, so that brings us to the end of chapter 1. So we just saw the basics of Fme Server and how to upload workspaces, the basics of how to run them, how to create a schedule, how version control works. Let me get to the module review here. Yeah, so we saw version control, we saw how to share a repository with other users on Fme Server, and then we saw how to share a workspace with other people who may not have access to Fme Server, and how to create this web service URL.
Okay, thank you very much. Hopefully you can also now see a screen that's presenting the Fme Server and data handling chapter. So I'm going to be running the rest of this morning's session with you all, and we're going to be working through chapter 2, and depending on timing, we might move on to part of chapter 3 as well. So this next chapter is going to be talking about data management in Fme Server and how we can upload data and share data with these workspaces that we are running. So nearly every Fme workspace starts by reading features from a source data set. And previously, we have been able to upload that source data with the workspace. However, this might not necessarily be the best best way to share this data with our workspace. And there are a number of different options on Fme Server to share this data. So we're going to work through those now. So that source data set may not necessarily be stored on a file system somewhere, but it might also be held in a database or stored on a web service, such as Google Drive, for example. And so there are different ways that we can share this information with Fme Server. So as we've already covered, in general, as an author, it's very easy to share a workspace with Fme Server so that it just works, as we can publish that data up at publishing time to Fme Server, and there's no need to really make any alterations to that source data. However, this is not necessarily the best method, depending on how we want the end user or other authors to be able to run that workspace. So we have a number of different methods that I'm going to work through with you for this chapter, and that will include using database and web connections. And we'll also go through managing file datasets. So as well as publishing files with the workspace in a repository, we can also look at uploading file datasets at runtime, and we can also look at more long-term solutions storing data on the resources file system within Fme Server. Oh, I'll just slide this so you can see this better. So the first thing that we're going to cover is using database connections. So when we look at source data that's stored in a database, Fme is capable of storing these connection parameters in what we refer to as a container. And this creation process takes place on Fme Desktop, which allows you to run your workspaces using data stored in databases. However, we can then publish these containers up to the Fme Server platform, so that as an author, you are also able to run those workspaces using these database connections. So database connections are essentially a storage for the parameters that are required to connect to your database. So these include the database server name, the port number, and any credentials that you may need to access that database as well. And the two main advantages of using database connections are that previously you had to embed these connection parameters directly into your workspace. And so moving over to database connections, this means there's less of a security risk. For example, if you're sharing your workspace with any other individual, they'd also need to have your database connection in order to run it, rather than those credentials being embedded in the workspace. But it also means that these connection parameters can be reused among multiple workspaces without you having to recreate those credentials. So, for example, if you then had to change a password, you could just change this on a single database connection, and you wouldn't have to go through all of the workspaces that use those credentials and change that connection in every single one. So as well as being less of a security risk, it also provides better management and maintenance for these database connections throughout all of your workspaces. So in order to create database connections, there are two different ways in Fme Desktop that this is done. Firstly, these connections can be created using the Fme Options menu in the Fme Workbench menu bar, and this allows you to define these connections, which can then be used within any of the readers, writers, or transformers. However, alternatively, once you add one of those readers or transformers that requires this connection into the workspace, there's the option at this time to add a new connection if there is no existing connection already created. And then once you've done this, you can see that you've created and added this connection in the navigator, both under the reader or the transformer connection, and there's also a separate panel that lists these database connections that that particular workspace is using. So once you've created this connection, just like with uploading source data, this needs to be made accessible to the Fme server and the engines running this workspace. So at this point, if there are any connections contained within your workspace, when you go through the publishing wizard in Fme Server, they'll become an additional window, which gives you the option to upload these connections. However, you don't have to upload the connection with the workspace. It might be that that connection already exists, in which case Fme Server will not check Fme Desktop will not have this box checked in the publishing wizard by default, because it should be able to recognize that there's a connection with the same name. However, alternatively, you may choose not to upload this connection because it was a test connection that you were using to just check these workspaces were running. And when you actually publish it to Fme Server, you want the end user to use their own connection in order to run that workspace. So you don't actually have to upload these connections, but there'll be the option in the publishing window to do this. And then once you enter Fme Server has its own menu for managing these connections as well. So this would be similar to the Tools Fme options in Fme Workbench, where it will list all of the existing database connections on your server. And you can then choose to copy, delete, or edit those existing connections. So this page is probably most likely managed by administrators, but by default, the Fme author role will also have access to this page. However, just like when Laura was running a job under the author account, they'd only be able to see the connections that belong to them, rather than the administrator would be able to see all of the connections available on Fme Server. So then, in order to use these database connections, when a workspace is run, similar to adding source data for a database reader or a connection within a transformer, this would be made available as a published parameter. So in the Fme Server user interface, you can then set this connection and the workspace will then run and complete as normal. So then moving forward, as well as database connections, we also have the option to add web connections through the Fme desktop platform into Fme Server. So similarly to the database connections, this is to provide a web connection for source data that's available from a web service. And Fme is again capable of storing these connection parameters in a secure container that can be published in Fme Server or recreated on the server through that connections menu. So again, a web connection allows you to include parameters such as the service, the username and password, and other parameters that will vary depending on what the web connection is. And just like database connections, there are two main advantages to using web connections over embedding this information into a single reader or transformer. And again, that is less of a security risk, and it also means that these connections can be used across your desktop in multiple different workspaces, and it makes these connections much easier to manage if there are any changes as well. So in order to create web connections, this is done through the Fme desktop interface by creating them using tools, and then going into the Fme options, and rather than database connections, this time we'll go into the web connections menu bar. And once these are defined, you will then be able to see them in the navigator. So in this example, we are reading in a CSV dataset. However, we are using a connection to a Google Drive web service rather than a file stored locally on our system. So we can see the reference to the file there, and then we can see that we are using a web connection here as well. So just like for databases, if there are any of these connections contained within your workspace, when you go to publish them to Fme Server, you'll come up with an additional dialog box that gives you the option to upload these connections. And then the connection is added to Fme Server. And you'll then be able to manage and edit existing connections within the Fme Server interface. What's important to note about the web connections is that Fme Safe have provided these service definitions for demonstration purposes, and the majority of these web connections require some kind of client ID and secret. And since these have been provided by Safe, it's possible that they may become deactivated. So if you're looking to start using web connections in a production environment, then we would recommend that you obtain your own client and secret and define your own web service connection from the Fme desktop page and upload this to Fme Server. So once a workspace is run, if the transformer or reader references a web service, then it will run correctly as in the Fme desktop page. And this will again be shown through published parameters on Fme Server so that you can go ahead and modify that URL if you so please. So as well as database and web connections, the key thing that majority of workspaces will require is the upload of source dataset to trigger and start that translation. So these are mostly stored as files rather than a feed or a database, and therefore there are a number of different options that we can look into to share this data with Fme Server. So the first thing that I would like to cover is what we have already previously performed when we were uploading the workspaces in Chapter 1, and that is publishing to an Fme Server repository along with the workspace. So in this example, this workspace uses source dataset map info tab, and this dataset is made up of a series of different files. So therefore, when we are publishing this workspace, we need to ensure that all of those data files are uploaded with the workspace for it to be able to run in Fme Server. So in order to do that, when we publish the workspace, there's simply a checkbox to upload data files, and Fme will be able to pick up all of the files that it is using in the current translation. However, there's also the option to select files if you feel that there's a file that was missing from this upload, or if you want to upload some of the source datasets, but you want some of the source datasets to be uploaded later on by an end user, for example. So you can then go ahead and select the files, and this will give you a list of all the files that Fme will be uploading. So you can go ahead and deselect or select them as necessary. Lastly, this dialog also allows you to change where the files you are uploading are published to. However, by default, these will be uploaded to the repository along with their workspace. So for now, we're not going to look at that option, but we will be looking at this later on in this chapter. So once the publishing wizard is complete, those files are uploaded to Fme Server, and they'll be tagged to use with this workspace only. So you may have noticed already when you're running these workspaces that this location is shown by this $sign and then the parentheses. And this essentially is an environment variable referring to the repository location that that workspace is stored in. So it's really just a shortcut for that particular workspace. And this will be automatically populated in the source and destination parameters at runtime. So there are no other settings or nothing else that needs to be changed. Once you've gone ahead and published this data, you can simply go to the Run Workspace page and your workspace will be ready to run. However, even though you can publish data as an author to an Fme Server repository, it's not an easy method for the end user because uploading to that repository makes it inaccessible to other workspaces or other users. So for files, rather than uploading with the workspace, there is the option to upload files at runtime through the Fme Server interface as well. So this particular workspace was created using a dynamic reader and writer, and that means that it's not specific to any one format, and it should be able to recognize the source data set at runtime based on the extension and be able to translate this. So in this scenario, publishing the data with the workspace isn't exactly what the aim of this workspace is, since it's created to be dynamic. That means that the source data set is constantly going to be changing based on the end user. So rather than publishing that data up with the workspace, we want them to be able to drop files into the web browser that will run the workspace then. So this is fairly easy to do in the Fme Server Run Workspace page. You will have noticed that when you uploaded, when you were running the exercise previously, as well as the location of the data you published with the workspace, there's also an option here to drop the files into the web browser, or you could also click to browse a file location as well. So if you were to click that page, you would then be opened with a window like this one, and you could select the tab to perform a temporary upload. And then by doing this, you can have a look in your local file directory and select all the files that you wish to upload to Fme Server. So in this example, as we mentioned, our source, we're using our map info tab source dataset, and these files, this dataset requires a number of different file types. However, we only actually want one single one of the items to be selected to pass through the workspace itself. If we were to select all 4 items, then this would trigger the workspace to run with all 4 of those files, and it wouldn't accept all the extension types. So even though we're uploading all 4 files here, we're only actually going to be selecting one of them for the workspace to be using. So there are some things that you need to be aware of as an author when you might be designing this workspace to run for an end user. Firstly, you need to be aware that giving the user uploadability could potentially cause a risk of workspaces to fail because there's a requirement that the dataset schema has to match the schema definition you created in the workspace. Of course, you could design the workspace to be dynamic, such as the example given above, to try and avoid this situation, or you just need to make sure that the access that you're giving to your end users, they're aware of the expected format input to ensure that these workspaces are going to be running successfully for them. Secondly, if we're doing a temporary upload, this is temporary, and the Fme server has a task cleanup scheduled to remove any files in this location that are older than 24 hours. So by uploading this way, it's not a long-term solution. So if you're looking to run a workspace on a regular basis using the same set of data, then this wouldn't be the option to choose when you're looking to give a workspace access to different data sets. And lastly, data uploaded by this user is accessible through the resources page. However, it's not in a location that an end user would necessarily have access to or be looking into. So it should be considered that this temporary data is only available for the workspace that it is being uploaded specifically for at that runtime, and it's not accessible to any other workspaces on Fme Server. So now let's move on to the first exercise of this chapter, and we'll have a look at creating a workspace to read and process data, and then we're going to be publishing it to Fme Server. So to start off today, we're going to be opening the workspace located here. So we're going to be looking in the Fme Data 2019 folder. And then we'll be going into the Workspaces folder. And then we'll be looking in Server Authoring. And we're going to be looking at Data Handling, Exercise 1, Begin. So you might recognize this workspace, as this is the same workspace as you created in the series of exercises in Chapter 1 yesterday. So we simply have two separate data sets, a firehose and neighborhoods, and we're using a clipper to merge those attributes. And currently we are writing this out to a null writer. So in this exercise, we're going to be looking at modifying this workspace. And one of the data sets it uses will be the same as the previous exercise. However, we're then going to have an additional data set, and we can look at publishing this data up to Fme Server. So the first thing that we're going to be doing is we're going to be removing the firehose data set from this workspace because we're no longer going to be using this data set. So in order to do that, we can simply right-click and delete. And we can do the same with the writer as well. Oh. Okay. Oh, very small. That was not what I was intending to do. There we go. Hopefully everybody could see that. Okay, so now our workspace should look something like this, and this time we're going to be using an elections geography markup language, so Gml Reader. So the first thing that we need to do is add this data to the workspace. So in order to do that, we can simply select Readers, Add Reader. And then for the format, we're going to specify GML. And there's a number of different options here, so be sure you just want to select the Geography Markup Language GML Reader format. And then for the dataset, we can return to Fme Data 2019. And then this time we'll be looking in Data, Elections, and then there'll be one file in here, the Elections Voting GML file. So we can select this dataset. And then we can click OK. And once you add this to the workspace, you should be given a dialog to select which feature types you want to add to the workspace. And for this example, we'll only be interested in the voting places, so we can deselect the voting divisions as we're not interested in using that dataset in our workspace. So once this dataset has been added, the first step is always to inspect that data so that we know what we're working with. So in order to do that, we can select the reader that we've just added to the workspace canvas, and then we can select this inspect icon from the ribbon floating above it. And once we select that, this should open the dataset up in Visual Preview. And if it's showing under the display control panel, so that's this second toggle down in the Visual Preview menu, you might see that since we are inspecting from this reader format, it is also showing the voting divisions. So we can simply deselect that, and we'll see the voting places dataset here is a series of points. So these are points locating the various voting places available in the Vancouver neighbourhood. So hopefully everybody should be able to see that in the Visual Preview menu. So now that we've inspected the data, we can go ahead and we want to add a writer for the voting places into this workspace as well. And since we already have a null writer in the canvas, we can simply right-click on the reader and select Duplicate on Null, and this will copy all the features from this reader onto this writer. So then I'm just going to make this larger just for a minute so you can all see what the workspace should look like now. So by duplicating onto Null, it will create a connection between the reader and this writer. However, this isn't how we want the connection lines to be set up. We want them to be the same as when we were using the firehose. So we can simply drag this connection across to the Clippy port. So the voting places reader is now connected to the Clippy port, and this means that all of the neighborhood attributes will be merged onto this point data. And then we can also create a connection from the inside output port of the clipper to the voting places. So your workspace should all now look like this. So I'm just going to give everybody a minute to make sure that they've got that set up before we move forward. Okay, so before we publish to server, there's one final step, and that is to set the voting places feature type name, as we did with the firehose, so that we are having a different feature type written out for each of the different neighborhoods. So in order to do this, we can select the cogwheel on the voting places writer, and then I'm going to select the drop-down arrow next to the feature type name and open a text editor. And this way, this gives me a list of all of the different FME feature attributes to add rather than having to manually type out the @value parenthesis. So I'll just put a dash, and then I can simply select the neighborhood name with a double click, and it will add that information in the correct format to ensure that it is written out. I don't have any spelling errors or anything like that. So once you've done that, you can select OK, and then OK again to save this information in the writer. And you should now be able to see, if you expand that writer, that this information has been added onto the name. And so this is shown in the writer there as well. So the last thing to do before we publish to FME Server is to save this workspace. So we can simply go File, Save As, to ensure we're not overwriting this beginning workspace. And rather than saving in the server authoring FME data course, we can go under Quick Access, and there should be a second folder called Workspaces there. And this simply saves it to the Documents FME Workspaces folder, which is the default folder to save your workspaces in for FME Desktop. And I'm going to shorten this, and I'm going to call this exercise 2.1, just for simplicity's sake. So just make sure you're naming this workspace with something that you remember going forward, as we will be using it in the next exercise as well. So once that workspace has been saved, we can then go ahead and publish it up to Fme Server. So we can do that in the same way as we had done previously by selecting File and then Publish to Fme Server. And you might notice here that this is a connection that we already created. And this is actually a web connection on Fme Server. So this is one of the connections that I was talking about previously. So when we chose that Add Web connection the first time we set up this connection, this is actually something that could also be published onto Fme Server as well. And it's saved in the menu option of Fme Workbench. So you can then go ahead and manage that web connection if you wanted to change the name of the connection, or if you, excuse me, if you had a change in credentials, for example. So I'm just going to give a moment to let everybody catch up. We've got a few people falling behind. And once we finish this exercise, we'll take a break as well. Okay, so hopefully everybody's got to the stage where they are now ready to publish that workspace to Fme Workbench. In order to do that, if you didn't already, you can just select File, Publish to Fme Server. And then we want to save this workspace in the training repository under exercise 2.1. So as you can see, the Upload Data Files box has not been checked by default. However, we want to upload these files so that they are available at runtime to the workspace. So in order to do that, we can select Files, and then we can go ahead and select them all. You might recall that the Vancouver Neighborhoods file was already used in a previous workspace. However, because we did the Publish at Runtime option, it's not going to be available on Fme Server for this workspace. So in order to reuse the data, we actually want to publish it up again. So we can select all three of these files. So once you've done that, you can go ahead and move through the next boxes of the publishing dialog. And again, we're not going to be registering the workspace with any other services at this time. So we can just publish them to the job submitter, which is checked by default, and then select Publish. So if you are using one of the EC2 training machines, or you have an Fme server that you have access to the file share system, you can actually go ahead and examine these files within the file browser. So let's go ahead and do that before we move over to Fme Server. So in order to do that, we're going to open the File Explorer. And this is an express install of Fme Server. And that means that the default location is in the local disk. So we can go to the This PC heading here and then select Local Disk. And the Fme Server file share is located in a hidden folder. So in order to view it, we first need to select View on the file directory, and then we're going to check the box Hidden Items. So once you've all done that, you should notice there's an additional folder now visible called Program Data. So again, in order to view that, you just need to select View, and then you need to select the Hidden Items checkbox, and you'll be able to view Program Data. So I just have a couple of users that look like they need me to slow down. So I'll just take a few minutes here and we'll just check where everybody is at, and I'll go back a step if needs be. Not sure exactly where people have fallen behind, so what I'll do is I'll just take it a few steps back and I'll go back to the workspace before we saved and published the workspace. So can I just get a hands up that everybody has a workspace that looks like this? Is there anybody that wasn't able to complete the workspace? Okay, so it looks like we have a couple of hands up for not completing the workspace. So I'll just go through that process again. So the first thing that we did was we added a Gml Reader onto the workspace. So we did that by going Reader and Add Reader. And then once we added this reader onto the workspace, we wanted to duplicate it onto the null writer. So in order to do that, we right-clicked on the reader and selected Duplicate on Null. Once this was added, the connection was going directly from Voting Places reader to the null writer. So we needed to change those connections. So we added the Voting Places reader to the Clippy input port, and then we added a output connection from the inside output port to the null Voting Places writer. And then the last step that we did to modify this workspace was we opened the text editor here and we changed the feature type name, so the individual feature types will be written for the voting places falling into each neighborhood. So once this workspace was completed, we're ready to save the workspace and then publish it to Fme Server. So to save the workspace, you can save it really anywhere that you're going to remember. However, by default, Fme saves workspaces in this Documents, Fme Workspaces location, and that's a folder that's available under the Quick Access tab. So that's simply where I'll be saving the workspaces for the exercises that I run through with you throughout the course of the week. So once this workspace has been saved, we'll now be ready to publish the workspace up to Fme Server. So to do this, we can select File, Publish to Fme Server, and this will bring up the publishing wizard. And we already have a connection that we created yesterday. So this is a web connection. So we can simply leave this selected and select Next. This second page is what we're focusing on in this exercise, as this is the option to upload data files along with your workspace. So we can ensure that we're saving the workspace in the training repository, which is where we want to save all the training exercises. And then we can leave the workspace name as what you saved it for in Fme Desktop, or we can rename it as you wish. I see there's somebody that's mentioned that they don't have this web connection, so I'll just go back and create that. If you didn't do this yesterday, this connection was created, so we can go ahead and from the drop down, we'll select Add Web Connection. And then you can specify a connection name, so you can leave it as the default, or call it training, for example. And then in the server URL, we can call, this will be http://localhost. And then the username and password are the credentials that we have been using to log into Fme Server so far. So that'll be admin and admin. And then you can go ahead and authenticate, and this connection should now be saved and you should be able to use it for the rest of the week. So once we've got that web connection, we are now connected to our Fme server, and we can specify the location of this workspace. And then you'll notice that by default, the upload data files box is not checked. And we could simply check this, and it will upload all of the data files associated with your workspace. Or alternatively, you can select this Select Files button, and this will list all of the files that Fme thinks are associated with the workspace, and you can go ahead and make a decision as to which ones you want to publish up with your workspace into a repository onto Fme Server. So you might recall that the Vancouver Neighbourhoods dataset was one that we used yesterday. However, we used it in a separate workspace, and we uploaded it specifically with that workspace. And that means that it's not available for use with this workspace. So for this exercise, we want to select all of these files here. So you can go ahead and select the checkbox next to Files to select them all, and then select OK. Once we've done that, we can select Next, and then we can publish, leaving it registered to the job submitter service only. Off this last exercise. So before the break, we finished publishing that workspace up to Fme Server, and we published it with 3 files that we selected to upload with the workspace. And this means that they are being uploaded to the repository where that workspace sits, and they'll only be available to that one workspace. So before we go into Fme Server and run this workspace, firstly, we want to dive into the Fme Server file share, which sits on the computer itself, and we can go and have a look at where we uploaded this data to. So this is an express install of Fme Server, and this means by default, the file system share is located in the local drive. So in order to do that, we can first go into the file directory, and then under the navigation panel, we want to select this PC, and then we want to select local disk. So you might notice that if you have a look in the exercise instructions, it asks you to look in the program data folder, and this is not listed on this file share at the moment. This is because this is a hidden item. This is hidden by default from Windows. It's not a folder that Fme Server has specifically created. Program data is just a hidden folder on Windows. And this is just so that people don't necessarily know it's there and don't go digging into the file share and touching things and moving things around that could potentially change the permissions or the access on Fme Server to make them inaccessible. However, since we're just having a look for this course, we can go ahead and view this hidden item. So in order to do that, we can select View from the file directory, and then there's a Hidden Items checkbox. So we can select View and then check this Hidden Items box. And once we've done that, you should notice that a program data folder now becomes available, and the yellow folder icon next to it is slightly grayed out. This indicates that it was actually hidden previously. So once you've all got program data, you can then go ahead and select that. And as you can see, there's a number of different apps and software that use this folder to store various things in. So we want to go ahead and look in the Safe Software folder. And then we'll have a look in the Fme Server folder. So repositories is hopefully now a word that you'll recognize, and that's the location that all the different Fme workspaces are uploaded to. So we can select repositories, and then we can see that we have a series of different repositories, as well as the ones available by default. We have that training repository that you created yesterday, and that we're uploading all of the workspaces throughout this course into this repository. So we can select training. So again, just to go back within program data, that was the Safe Software folder, Fme Server, repositories, and then training. And hopefully you'll see a series of different folders for the exercises that we have uploaded so far. And if you were to then go and have a look in one of these folders, you would see that as well as the FMW file, so the actual workspace file, this is where all the data that we chose to select on publishing time is also saved. So as you can see, it's in more of a hidden location that is inaccessible on the actual Fme server interface itself, because if we were to go into the repositories folder on the Fme server web UI, you can only actually see the stored workspace. So when we upload files in this way, this means that they're really only available for the workspace that they've been uploaded with, and you won't be able to reference them to use within any other workspace. So the last step of this exercise is to simply return to Fme Server and run the workspace. So let's dive onto the Fme Server homepage, and hopefully you're all still logged in. If you weren't, then we are logged in under the admin account at the moment. And before we run this workspace, we can go ahead and have a look in the repositories directory, so we can just see the difference between this and the file storage system behind the scenes. So if we were to have a look on here, as you can see, we have the 5 different folders that were also available in the directory. But once we go into training, we can simply see that the FMW files, and we can't see any of the other files that were published to be used with them. So now we can go ahead and run the workspace. So we'll select the training repository. And then we want to select this time exercise 2.1. And you may have noticed already that rather than displaying an entire file location, it simply shows this Fme MF directory within this $ and parentheses. And we'll cover these in a bit more detail later, but essentially this is a shortcut reference for the Fme engine, so it knows to go ahead and look in the location that the Fme workspace is stored, and it will also be able to find these different files. So the final step of these exercises is that we are going to assume that as a user, rather than using this information that has been shared up with Fme Server, we want to upload temporary data to the system instead. So what we're going to do here is to ensure that this workspace will still run successfully. We are going to use the same file, but we're just going to give it a different name so it can be recognized as a separate file. So in order to do that, we're going to return to the Fme Data 2019 folder. So we'll go into the file directory here. And then under the Quick Access tab, we're now going to move away from the Fme Server Share folder, and we're going to return to Fme Data 2019. And once we're in the Fme Data 2019 folder, we'll have a look in the Data folder. And then under Elections, we want to change the name of this Elections Voting. So we want to essentially make it a new file by changing that name. So in order to do that, we can simply rename this file, and we're going to call it New Election Voting. So that was in Fme Data 2019, Data, and then the Elections folder. And then we've simply renamed the GML file to New Election Voting. There's no need to do anything with the schema file. We can still leave the name as it is and upload it, and it will still work with this GML dataset. So now that we've renamed this file, we can go into Fme Server and upload this using the temporary upload option to run the workspace. So in order to do this, we could simply drag this file from the file directory. However, for demonstration purposes, we're going to click to browse on this dialog here, and a pop-up box will show up, allowing you to either select a resource that's uploaded on Fme Server, or in this example, we're going to be doing a temporary upload. Don't be concerned about this warning at the top. This is because this location is not in the resources folder, so Fme Server is telling us that it doesn't exist because it doesn't exist in the location that is available here. So when you open up this click to browse option, it will list the resources. However, we want to do a temporary upload. So the first step here is to select the temporary upload tab at the top of the page. And then you should be brought to a window here, which shows that there are currently no temporary files available. So the next thing we want to do is upload the file. So in order to do that, we're simply going to select this middle button here under temporary uploads, which if you hover over will say upload file. And then we want to navigate to that folder with the elections or new elections voting GML file that we just renamed. So in order to do that, we can go to Fme Data 2019, Data, Elections, and then we have the new elections voting file here. So as well as uploading the GML file, we also need to upload this schema file so that Fme Server has access to this file. So we can select both of these files, and we can temporarily upload both of these to the Fme Server interface. So that was in Fme Data 2019, Data Elections, and then we're selecting both the renamed GML file and the schema file as well. And notice that once you upload these files, these will become available under the selected items option as well here. However, even though we've uploaded the schema file, we don't need it to be available under, opened it too wide there. There we go. We don't need it to be published to the source dataset. Otherwise, both of these datasets will trigger a run and the schema file will fail. So even though we want to upload both of these so Fme Server has access to them, we only actually want the GML file to be selected to run with the workspace. So we can simply select that cross next to the XSD file to remove that from the selected items list. So once you've done that, ensure that only the GML file is selected, and then you can select OK. And now you'll notice that there's no longer any variable in front of the file name. It simply has the file name of the temporary upload there. So once we've done this, we can now select Run, and the workspace should complete successfully using the temporary uploaded data. However, what's important to be reminded of is that this was a temporary upload, and that means that after 24 hours, this file will be cleaned up automatically by the system and will no longer be available for running with this workspace. So if we were then to go and run the workspace now, we would still be able to use that file. However, if we came back at this time tomorrow and tried to run it, we'd have to perform that upload again to have success running the workspace. So hopefully everybody was able to complete that exercise. And we're now going to move on to look at the final method of managing source data in Fme Server. And this final method allows for more long-term file sharing with workspaces, and also means that you can share files across multiple different workspaces. Okay, so it looks like a couple of people are still trying to complete that last exercise. So we'll just go over that temporary upload one more time to make sure that everybody understood how that process worked before we move forward. So the first thing that we want to do is go onto the Run Workspace page of Fme Server. And then we can select the training repository and select Workspace Exercise 2.1. And so if you weren't able to complete the exercise yet, your source destination will look slightly different from this, and it will still look similar to the Vancouver neighborhoods one, referring to this variable here. So in order to perform a temporary upload, we can simply select Drop Files here. And then this will open you up onto the Resources page. So we want to select the Temporary Uploads tab because this isn't a file that's stored in the Resources system of Fme Server. So instead we can select Temporary Upload here. And I'm just going to remove these so that I can do the process again with you. So your temporary upload window should currently look similar to this. And then we can select the Upload File button here. And then you want to have a look in the repository that in the folder that we renamed the election voting GML file. So we want to select Fme Data, Data, Elections, and then we want to select the new elections voting GML file. However, GML files also require an associated schema file with them. So we also need to select the elections voting.xsd file. So make sure that both of these files have been selected, and then you can press the Open button to upload these up to Fme Server. So now you should see that there is an XSD and a GML file under the temporary uploads list. And you will also see that both of these are under the selected items list. The selected items is the files that the workspace is actually going to use. And even though we need the schema file available on Fme Server for the engine to read, we actually don't want the workspace reader to be reading in the XSD file. So we can select the cross button here. So we want to make sure that under selected items, only the file with the extension GML is selected. And once we've done that, we can select OK. I'm not sure why this is grayed out. Like because I've already uploaded it, I think. So I've already uploaded it, so it's grayed out, so I can't upload it again. But if you select OK, or it's not showing it, that's interesting. There we go. I'm not sure what was going on there. So this button should be green and you should be able to click it. And then once you've done that, the file name will be listed as the source, and you can go ahead and run that workspace and it should run successfully. So hopefully everybody was now able to complete that exercise, performing a temporary upload of files onto Fme Server. So the final method of managing source data that I'll be working through with you all today is more long-term solutions. So if you want data to be available to run on your workspace long time, so for example, if you want to perform a schedule every single day with the same set of data, then you could use this option to ensure that the data is always available on the Fme Server system without you needing to do any temporary upload every day. And this is also important for if you want to use the same data sets for running multiple workspaces, rather than uploading that data and publishing it with every single workspace you publish. You can simply store it all in one central system that you can then refer the workspace back to using resources. So firstly, what are resources? Resources is an inbuilt file management system that allows for data and other files to be published to the Fme Server instance. And this is also a location that Fme Server uses to store and write operations out to as well. So for example, any log files that Fme Server writes would also be stored in these resources. So resources can be managed in the Fme Server web interface. So through the menu here, we also have a resources section. And you may have noticed when we were looking in program data in the file directory, we looked at repositories, but there was also a resources folder listed here. So that program data is essentially Fme Server's file system, and resources is one component of that where we recommend storing all of your data. So there is one data folder in the resources system called data, and that is where we recommend storing all of your data sets. And you can go ahead in there and create different folders, and you can also manage your data in there as well. So once it's uploaded, you can move it, download it, etc. So it's available to anybody that has access to the resources folder as well. So as well as uploading this data through the web interface, we can also upload this data on publishing time, as we would if we were publishing data directly for that workspace. However, there's the option there to select the location. So rather than simply selecting the files and then moving on through the publishing wizard, we could then select a location, and rather than uploading to the specific repository that that workspace belongs to, we can select to upload it to a shared resource folder, so that it then becomes available on through the Fme Server web interface as well. And lastly, as I mentioned, the Fme Server resources exists within that program data file share. So if you're on the local machine, you would also be able to move data into this folder using that route as well. So there's 3 different ways that we can push data up into the resources folder: through the web interface, when you're publishing an Fme workspace, or through the Fme Server repository within the file directory. And lastly, although I've said that the resources is an Fme Server file share, there's also the option to add a resource connection to other locations, either UNC paths for shared folders, or we also have the option to add Amazon S3 file systems as a resource connection as well. So when we select New here, there are 2 different types of resources that we can create. And when we do this, this means that any other information stored in those folders is also now accessible through the Fme Server web interface. So you don't necessarily have to upload your data onto Fme Server. If it's saved in one of these folders that is shared, then it will also be available to you to run workspaces on Fme Server. So similarly to when we were doing temporary uploads, in order to use your resource data in a translation, it's simply a case of clicking Browse for a source or destination dataset, and then there'll be a resources option, and it will list all of the folders available in resources, so you can go and navigate to the data that you have uploaded and that you'd like to set your workspace to run using. And this can be done for both source and destination datasets, so you can write to a location on Fme Server as well. When you select data through the resources, just like when you were publishing data with the workspace at runtime, you'll notice that rather than showing a full file path, it simply shows this $ and parentheses. And this is just a shortcut. The Fme engine knows that this location refers to the data folder in the Fme Server resources. So there are a number of benefits for using resources as a data management system. And this is because the data is now available to be used by any workspace without having to upload it every time. And it also means that data can be stored locally to the Fme Server engine, so there's no need to be concerned about any permissions. And you can also use resources that are mapped and shared from a physical drive, so not necessarily on the Fme Server itself, but the users still have access to that data. And lastly, it is a more permanent solution, so it's something that's long-termed, and the data will not be removed unless you or another author or administrator goes and removes that data from the Fme Server. So we can select data from the resources folder from the Fme Server web interface. However, as an author, you may also want to set this up in a parameter without the end user having to go ahead and select that. So in order to do this, there's some required authoring in the Fme Workbench using Fme Parameters. So far we've been looking at published parameters for the source and destination dataset definitions. However, there's also a section for Fme Server Parameters. And in Fme Workbench, they are not set to any values. However, if they are used within a transformer or within another parameter, once this is pushed to Fme Server will automatically be able to populate the value of that parameter. So, for example, the Fme security user returns the name of the user running that workspace, or the Fme server host returns the host name of your Fme server, etc. So in terms of using resources, there are two Fme server parameters. We have the Fme server shared resource data and the Fme shared resource temp. So these are simply shortcuts to the data and the temp folder within Fme server resources. So this means that we can then go ahead and use these parameters when we define a location in Fme Workbench, so that once this is published up to Fme Server, the source or destination is known to look in Fme Server without the end user having to specify this at runtime. And we can do that by using these shortcuts. So in order to do that, all of these are listed in the drop-down menu whenever we go to a source or destination dataset, and they are listed under user parameters, Fme server parameters, or we can simply do this in the navigator of Fme Workbench as well. However, what you'll notice is if you link a source or destination dataset to one of these parameters in Workbench, the parameter will be displayed in red, and this is because within Fme Desktop, this value is not set, and so running the Workbench in Fme Desktop will not succeed because it doesn't know where to look for this data. But what you can do to ensure that the workspace is running correctly is you can simply set a value for that Fme server parameter. However, so you can set a value for that Fme server parameter, and then once this is published to Fme server, this will be replaced by the actual path, and the data will be read as expected from the Fme server location. So for all of the resources on Fme server, there are actually shortcuts like this. It's just by default, only the data and the temp one are saved on the Fme Workbench. So when you create resource connections, you'll also be able to use these shortcuts to refer to these as well. So we just have one final exercise to run through, and then we'll wrap up for today. So in this final exercise, we want to look at uploading data to a resource folder and then referring to it in that way in the Workbench instead. So in order to do this, we want to use the exercise that we created in the earlier exercise. And then we can edit the source and destination so that they are referring to a location on this resources folder instead. So the first thing that we actually want to do is we want to create some folders in the Fme server resources where we want this data to be uploaded and stored. So if you return to the Fme server interface and make sure you're logged in as the admin, and then we can go ahead and select resources. So we want to store all of our data in the data folder on resources. So once we're on the resources page, we can select data, and then we're going to create a new folder. And we're going to call this folder election. So once you've gone onto resources and selected the data folder, we're going to create a new folder called election. And then within this, we also want to create two new subfolders. We want to create one folder that we are going to upload the input data to, and then we also want to write out data to the Fme Server resources location. So we're also going to create an output folder. So we'll repeat the process that we did when we created the election folder, and we'll select the Create Folder button, and we'll select Input for a new folder name, and then we'll do the same thing for the Output folder. Oh, if I can spell. So at this point in resources, you should be able to see we're in the data election folder, and then we've created an input and an output subfolder in that election folder. So the next thing that we want to do is we want to upload the source data sets into this input folder. So firstly, we'll click on this folder. And at the moment, there are no items stored in this folder since we just created it. So we can then go ahead and upload the election voting and also the Vancouver neighborhoods files. So we can select files. And firstly, we'll upload the elections voting one. So that's in Fme data 2019, data elections. And just like with the temporary upload, we want to make sure that we're uploading the schema and the Gml file. Oh, not the election results one. So make sure you've selected the election voting schema file, the XSD file, and the Gml file, and then select Open. So the Vancouver neighborhoods KML file is stored in a separate folder, so we can then go ahead and repeat that upload process for the Vancouver neighborhoods. So we'll select Upload, Files, and then we'll return to Fme data 2019, Data, Boundaries, and then we'll select Vancouver neighborhoods. So at this point, you should have 3 files uploaded into the input folder. However, in the workspace so far, we've simply been using a null writer. So even if we set the destination to the output folder, nothing would actually be written here. So before we are ready to set this workspace up, we need to go ahead and make some changes. So we can go ahead and open Fme Workbench and then open the workspace that we were using in exercise 2.1. So if your Workbench closed, this should be listed under the recent workspaces, under the name that you saved the workspace under. If you weren't able to complete that workspace, if you go to the top of the exercise on this server authoring manual, it should list the location of a completed exercise that you can pull up. So I'll just give everybody a moment to get this workspace open.